Feel free to disagree, but I think it's inarguable that Green Day is the most commercially successful punk band of all time.
Oh my God, who the hell cares?
Say what you want about some of their stylistic choices, but there's no debate that the band has always found a way to stay relevant. It's pretty impressive given the fact they've been a unit for about 30 years. What's even more amazing is they've never really had a time when they were like a down on their luck band. But there was a time when I would say they were struggling with some apathy from the general fan base. Now, before you spam the comment section, I'm talking about a very specific time period. Say between the year 2000 and the release of American Idiot. Can we agree on that?
That I can't help you, man.
So let's get into it. We're going to take a look at a brief moment when Green Day was not the center of mainstream American punk rock. In case you're unaware, here's an abridged history of the band. In the late 80s, childhood friends Billie Joe Armstrong and Mike Dirnt formed a band originally known as Sweet Children. Sweet Children would fight for respect in the emerging East Bay punk scene. They were a junior band in the shadow of cult heroes like Operation Ivy, and even in those days, they were thought to be too melodic for the DIY scene. Glad to see some things never change. Eventually, Sweet Children would come to be known as Green Day, and they would join up with drummer of the Lookouts, Tré Cool. And actually, eventually, they would also get the privilege of playing at the iconic 924 Gilman Street. The band would release their first 2 albums on Lookout Records before signing to Reprise. But once they got to Reprise, they hit the jackpot when they released 1994's Dookie. I mean, this thing absolutely exploded. The success of Dookie can't be understated. It made the prospect of actually playing punk rock a viable career opportunity. It's difficult for a band to find this type of success, but it's extra difficult for a band to maintain this level of success. And to be honest, they never really matched the success of Dookie, at least in the 90s, but they did manage to maintain a very successful career. Their 2 follow-up albums, Insomniac and Nimrod, both went multi-platinum and charted into the single digits. Heck, a song from Nimrod came to be associated with the finale of Seinfeld, and like 1,000 graduations. So originally, I had the song Graduation by Vitamin C playing here, but it kind of got blocked by the YouTube police. But you know what song it is, just go ahead and imagine that song in your brain, and you get the joke? Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming. And I think in a lot of ways, that song's a perfect summation of the band in this era. They belonged much more or equally to alternative rock as they did to punk rock in this time period. After signing to Reprise, Green Day was alienated by so many in the punk rock universe. I think the late 90s is a manifestation of that alienation. Just as Green Day was changing in the late 90s, so was the music scene. When they hit it big with Dookie in 94, grunge had really reached its saturation point and was really on the way out. In the wake of the demise of grunge, mainstream rock took on a few different forms. There was post-grunge, which were bands that really took inspiration from the initial wave of grunge and put a little bit of their own spin on it. Those bands actually got really popular, I think, as the 2000s went on, even more so than the late 90s. At this same time, major labels were actually pouring music into third wave ska bands. And of course, if you think late 90s heavy music, you gotta include nu metal. It's required. But while nu metal was reaching an apex in the late 90s, punk was in kind of a dissonant place. There really wasn't a wave of punk that was setting the world on fire, but there were a few bands that were planting their flags. 2 in particular really seemed to stand out. By 99, Blink-182 had transformed their unique brand of humor and adolescent themes into legit pop superstardom. During that same time, the Offspring had went from indie darlings to MTV regulars. This is an interesting one. How do you describe Warning? It's alternative, acoustico, punko? I'm gonna go with that. This one really seems to be written for the fan that was more partial to Good Riddance than Longview. With all that said, there's some pretty good songs. The problem, if there is one, is that this album sounds like an acoustic version of a really good release. I'll be honest, it sounds like they came into the studio with some really good material, but left with the final product that was less than inspired. Now, there's been a lot of retrospective rehabilitation of this album, likely because of the quality of the songwriting, but in the moment, this thing was not well received at all. If you look at the raw numbers, this was objectively a low point for the band. So think about it, people were still paying for music in the year 2000. And in the US, it sold approximately 1.2 units. That's great for punk, and pretty good for pop punk. For some reference, Good Charlotte's debut album, released a month earlier, sold only 500,000 in the US, and Blink-182's revered 1997 release Dude Ranch sold only 1.2 million domestically. but in the world of Green Day, this was a significant dip. It's the only album in a 15-year time span that didn't sell at least 2 million records. And let's actually rewind for a second. Let's go back to the summer before Warning was released, when Green Day played their one and only Warped Tour. Let that set in for a second. What is more bizarre? The fact that Green Day only played one Warped Tour, or that they needed to play the Warped Tour in the year 2000? When you look at it a little closer, it actually makes sense that they only played one Warped Tour. By the time the Warped Tour launched, Green Day had already shot into superstardom. They were already playing the massive normie festivals. But I should note, though, that there was a relationship between the Warped Tour founder Kevin Lyman and Green Day. Lyman basically served as their father figure during the 1994 Lollapalooza tour. God bless him.
Well, this is what I can tell you. They have been called punk rock's hyperactive problem children, and I guess tonight we could say they lived up to that moniker. The hallmark of this group is that they like to act up on stage, and they're given to sort of crude antics like spitting and throwing stuff around, which they used to great effect at Woodstock.
But back to 2000. Green Day playing the Warped Tour in 2000 kind of seems like a signal that they knew they were losing their grip on the youth alternative culture. Of course, releasing an album like Warning was probably not a great way to avoid only being popular with the mom rock crowd. When the album cycle for Warning wore down, Green Day kind of reverted into being like this nostalgic legacy act. And when you think that they've had 20 years of success after that time period, that's very impressive, because it really looked like they were just going to be a one-note band for the rest of their careers. And what's the move when you're a nostalgia brand? You released a greatest hits album. It had 2 original songs. Also, if you look at when this was released, that was not a great time to release new material. They actually would double down in the summer of 2002 and release another album of unreleased tracks. This is the point in the story where our heroes are at their weakest point. But like any great narrative, the old gunslinger licks his wounds and proves that he can still win any shootout. In the spring and summer of 2002, Green Day would co-headline the Pop Disaster Tour. Now, who was the headliner, you might ask? It was the aforementioned Blink-182, who was absolutely huge at this point, coming off yet another smash hit record. But I'm going to go against my instincts, and I'm going to declare that hierarchies are a good thing. Well, at least as they pertain to major music tours.
Listen, now you are so dumb. You are really dumb.
The reason why I say this is because the better live band always ends up outshining the bigger band. It's happened for years and years. It happens back in the early 90s with bands like Metallica and Guns N' Roses, and it happened here with Blink-182 and Green Day. Again, that's not shade on Blink. They write really, really good songs, and they have connected with their audience to this day in a very meaningful way. But let's be honest, nobody's ever spent their Saturday night watching YouTube videos of great Blink performances.
You're as cold as ice.
It is what it is. And back in 2002, Green Day seemed to make it their mission to prove who was the best of the genre. And on the final stop on the road to American Idiot is Cigarettes and Valentines. The mythical Cigarettes and Valentines. What's the matter? You don't got that one on vinyl? Well, because it doesn't actually exist. According to legend, the band worked on what was to be the follow-up to Warning for months, only to have the master tape stolen. Instead of continuing with their original vision, the band would go back to the drawing board, and what they came back with eventually turned out to be American Idiot. I have no idea if these details are true. Really, I don't. I mean, if those masters were really stolen, why haven't they emerged on the internet somewhere? I just can't explain that. My suspicion is that they felt pretty uninspired with what they had put down, and they decided to refocus. Whether the masters were lost, whether they were stolen, whether they buried them in some kind of ceremony. I don't know, but that was the best possible move they could have made for their career. To be fair, the band has claimed that they were happy with the material they were producing, and in 2009 they released the song Cigarettes and Valentines, and I gotta say, it's not bad, but it does not compare to the stuff they had on American Idiot. And that brings us to September 2004, when American Idiot was released and Green Day was essentially reborn. So what happened to Green Day during this time? Well, I can't really give like a concrete answer. I will offer the theory that Green Day just did not fit into the early 2000s scene. And if you look at it, the album they released at the start of the decade did not jive with what was happening in either punk or metal. As a band, they were understandably maturing, but that's not what audiences at the time were craving. Secondly, despite being one of the godfathers of pop punk, they were really a different type of band than the ones that were blowing up in the early 2000s. I'll let my man, the punk rock MBA, explain exactly what I mean.
I'm gonna make a controversial call here and say that they're actually not part of the big four of pop punk because of their age. Because when I think of pop punk, I think of like the late 90s, early 2000s, American Pie, TRL kind of era, and Green Day were just not part of that. What it comes down to is that Green Day is a great band, but I think they were a punk band that played poppy music, whereas Blink was a pop band that played punky music. Because to me, that's really what the TRL era of pop punk was all about.
Yeah, I know that the late 90s and early 2000s is when we associate this new boom of pop punk, but I think if we look at it a little closer, they were still competing for real estate with things like nu metal and post-grunge. It really wasn't until maybe 2003, 2004, about the time American Idiot came out, where pop punk really just blew up and became everywhere. It was still in a bit of an embryonic phase in the late 90s. And actually, when you think about it, by the time American Idiot was released, things like the Warped Tour, Fuse, Punk Voter, and of course the internet as a whole were more prominent in alternative-ish youth culture. Yes, MTV and radio were still very, very important, but the real estate for different variants of punk was much, much larger in this time period. The culture as a whole, too, was much more ready for American Idiot in 2004 than they were for Warning in 2000. But before I get out of here, I should note that maybe I'm overemphasizing their decline in this period. While yes, Warning was a bit of a flop, the nostalgia era might not have been a low point, but a deliberate plan on behalf of the label. For further context on this, check out Ian Winwood's great book, Smash. I mean, that guy would know. If it was a deliberate play, it obviously worked phenomenal for them. And if you think about it, it's kind of a forerunner to how bands operate now, more as brands than actual musical acts. Whatever happened to the band in this area, I'm glad this period exists. It feels like Green Day really needed a reset. Instead of burning out, they were reborn. And for the most part, it's a better place because of it. What do you think? Is this era of the band underrated? Did they need this time? Sound off down below in the comment section. See you next week.